The Recording Industry Association of America recently filed 2 copyright infringement cases based on the alleged mass infringement of copyrighted sound recordings by AI music generation services Suno and Udio. Naturally, this lawsuit created a lot of waves in the music production world, and many YouTubers have already commented on it. What strikes me though is that most of these commentary videos get some of the very fundamental issues and questions surrounding this lawsuit completely wrong, at least in my opinion. Yes, this lawsuit points to some very serious issues around AI music generation, but in my opinion, not in the way you most likely think it does. In this video, I therefore want to add my perspective to this discussion by reacting to 2 YouTube videos that I found particularly interesting, one by Viva Beats and one by Top Music Attorney. I do need to point out that I'm a big fan of both channels, and I'm not implying that they said anything that is incorrect. Rather, my argument is that their perspective is a little bit incomplete. And in case you are new to my channel and are wondering why the heck I think I can contribute something meaningful, welcome. My name is Michael Wagner, and I'm a media technology educator with more than 30 years of experience researching and working with emerging technologies. If you want to know more about what I did in the past, I invite you to check out my channel, particularly some of my earlier videos that were published prior to 2013. And with that being said, let's roll the intro. Before I get started, I need to point out that I'm not a lawyer and nothing that I'm going to say is going to be legal advice. However, through my decades of experience in implementing emerging media technologies, I've collected quite a bit of knowledge about media and copyright law. Nevertheless, should I say something that you feel is incorrect, let me know in the comment section. I will be happy to correct any mistakes or address any open issues or questions in a future video. So let's jump into the first video, which is entitled "This Will Destroy AI Music" by Viva Beats. In case you're not familiar with Viva Beats, this is an outstanding and highly entertaining channel about all things new and newsworthy in the music production world. And he recently published a video that I think perfectly exemplifies a very common misconception about the purpose of the lawsuit that the major record labels brought against Suno and Udio. So let's hear what Viva Beats had to say.
What is going on today, guys? There have been recent developments with AI generative music that may spell out the beginning of the end. For them, not for us. Yeah, usually people say that and they're like, this is the beginning of the end of music. No, it's the other way around this time.
Now, I do understand why he said that, and he was probably catering to his audience and trying to make a point, really. I think it's a little bit naive to believe that this is the beginning of the end of AI music, because in my opinion, it's actually just the opposite. It's really more the beginning of the beginning, because what this lawsuit is supposed to do is it is supposed to create a precedent that clarifies how copyright is used or copyright is applied to AI-generated music and how record labels can benefit financially from AI-generated music. So it's really more the beginning of the beginning. It's not really the beginning of the end. Now I'm going to jump around a little. I'm not going to play the entire video. And if I'm missing anything that you think was important, just let me know in the comment section. But I feel we don't really need to watch the entire video. I just wanted to kind of make a couple of points. So let's jump ahead a little.
So it's definitely a great time to not be one of these AI music platforms. I honestly couldn't be happier, though. I'm like a kid on Christmas who just got a Nintendo 64. I'm excited. I can't wait.
Now, once again, I think this is a little bit naive. Kind of to be excited about that. Anxious probably is the more correct term. We don't really know how this is going to play out. The main purpose of this lawsuit, once again, I think, is for the record labels to establish their claim on how to use AI-generated music. That might mean that artists benefit from it, but it's not completely certain. It probably just means that the record labels are going to benefit from that. And we will see how that's going to play out for the artists.
Now, the motives of these record labels is probably pretty greedy just based on this statement here. The music community has embraced AI. No, we haven't. And we are already partnering and collaborating with responsible developers to build sustainable AI tools centered on human creativity that put artists and songwriters in charge. But we can only succeed if developers are willing to work together with us. Unlicensed services like Suno and Udio that claim it's fair to copy an artist's life work and exploit it for their own profit without consent or pay set back the promise of genuinely innovative AI for us all. Now, obviously, they're not completely against AI based on that statement, but realistically, they're just mad that they're not getting cut in on it.
And that's really it. So the main purpose of this copyright lawsuit is really to establish precedent that allows record labels to monetize music that has been generated with artificial intelligence. And once again, we will see how that actually plays out. Now, let's jump ahead a little because the next couple of minutes it talks about fair use, and I don't think that really applies here that much. So let's jump ahead a bit.
Suno and Udio have been questioned in the past about what their AI is trained on, but never gave a straight answer. Hold on, let me change something really quick. Okay, that's better. The funny thing is one of their investors said what they weren't willing to say. Suno investor Antonio Rodriguez admitted that Suno do not have licenses for whatever music it was trained on. Yeah, he probably shouldn't have said that. They're gonna have to murder this guy now. He said it was
Well, not really. I think that was a very deliberate statement, and I'm going to come back to that in a second.
was no concern to him because this lack of such licenses is the risk we had to underwrite when we invested in the company, because we're the fat wallet that will get sued right behind these guys. If we had deals with the labels when this company got started, I probably wouldn't have invested in it.
And I think that's really the key. So when there were investors invested in these artificial intelligence companies, they already did that with the expectation that they would be sued. And the reason for that is because they are operating in an environment where there are very little regulations right now. So this is kind of completely unexplored territory, and we don't really know how this works out. And if you want to be a successful investor, you sometimes need to take risks, and this is a risk that they decided to take. I think they were completely aware that they will get sued, and I would not be surprised at all if the investors in these companies invested with the express expectation that their money would be used for a lawsuit like this. Because once again, this lawsuit is supposed to establish precedent on how to deal with music generated by artificial intelligence. And as an investor, you want to be on the forefront of this. You want to be the first one, and you want to be the one that sets the rule. I think by investing in these companies, these investors are able to do that. So no, I don't think this was a mistake. I think this was a very deliberate statement to make sure that everybody understands we are here, we have the money, we are prepared, and we are going to make sure that this is playing out in a way that we think it should play out, and we will see how that ends up with. But once again, I don't think this was a mistake. I think this was a very deliberate statement. Okay, so let's now turn it over to a video by top music attorney, and that video is entitled Suno AI Caught Infringing Copyright Amidst Major Lawsuit. In case you've never heard of Top Music Attorney, this is a channel that covers all things legal in music production. And I have to admit that I'm not the biggest fan of how this channel presents the arguments. It's always a bit clickbaity to me, but it is an excellent channel nonetheless, and it generally gives very good advice. So let's hear what she had to say. Now, her video starts with sentiments similar to Viva Beats. I'm going to jump ahead a little, so let's see.
Something I've been saying on this channel is I just go, when it comes to the fact that copyright does not carry with AI created stuff. It just doesn't, because pursuant to copyright law, the thing, in order to have copyright protection, has to be made by a human author. And I've just speculated that, in order to change that, it's going to have to be a big enough deal for an AI, one of these AI companies, right, like a sync house.
No, I think this is actually an excellent point, because one of the main purposes of this lawsuit, in my opinion, is also to challenge the state of quo that says that AI-generated music is not copyrightable because it was not generated by a human. And in order for music companies and labels to monetize music, they would need the copyright on those music. So my feeling is that one of the main purposes of this lawsuit is indeed to challenge that and to make sure that somebody owns the copyright to that music that has been generated by artificial intelligence. And most likely, the record labels want to be the ones who have the copyright. That's just a guess, but I think it's a good guess. Now she then continues reacting to another video from Sync My Music, and I'm going to leave links to all these videos in the description below. I highly recommend checking them out. They're really, really interesting. So let's see what she had to say in terms of that video from Sync My Music.
Just like with Udio, Suno has built some very impressive technology here, and it leaves many of us wondering how exactly did they also seemingly leapfrog all the competition and all the other AI generative companies and models out there like Stable Audio 2.0 and Meta's AudioCraft, which both have publicly disclosed where and how they've licensed their music data. Is Suno's AI model, the actual tech itself, just that much more impressive and capable? Or did Suno just skip all of the trouble of getting consent and licensing the music that they've trained their model with? I don't know. I have no insight as to what's going on behind the scenes over there.
But this is actually an excellent point because we have no clue on how these models actually work. We just have some general understanding on how generative artificial intelligence works in general. And it is true that, in order to have a better model, you need better training material. And as we see a little bit later, my feeling is that they used copyrighted material in order to train their model. However, once again, I think they did that on purpose, completely expecting that copyright lawsuit in order to set precedent in how we are going to deal with these technologies in the future.
In reviewing the complaint of what the record labels are saying, because they are saying that these platforms are actually downloading copies, having the AI study from it. And I even checked with my experts who do app development. I go, look, I need to understand this. You work with AI in order to understand how this works. Are there copies kind of kept on file? And so it was explained to me that apparently you can have the AI learn and keep copies, right, in its memory, but it's really not necessary. Once it actually goes through the step to learn, right, it no longer needs the actual asset.
Now, this is actually completely correct. So essentially, the way training works with these types of models is that they just listen to the music or whatever they are training on, really. And then essentially adjust the parameters inside the model. And once the training is done, the asset that is used in order to train the model is no longer needed. I doubt that they store it somewhere. I mean, it's possible that they do. Once again, we don't really know how that works in detail. We also don't really know how the training works in detail for these models. But, once the model really has learned from a particular asset, that asset is no longer needed. And quite frankly, there's no reason to keep that. So I'm completely expecting that these models are not storing anything at all. So they're just kind of listening to that material and learning from it. And there's a very interesting question there in terms of listening. Is it copyright infringement if an AI model listens to something that, for example, it never stores, right? So that is actually a very interesting question. Now, I do agree that should Suno or Udio actually download the material, store it on their servers, and then learn from that material that is stored on their servers, that would be problematic. But once again, we don't really know how to do that. And technically, it's not necessary. I mean, they could just learn from listening and, might not even do any copyright infringement. So once again, these are all things that we have no precedent for. And the lawsuit is really there in order to establish how this is going to be treated in the future. Now, the video then goes into discussing a very interesting thing that happens with Suno, and that is when you quote a certain producer tag, and those producer tags are little snippets that producers put in front or at the beginning of their music in order to identify themselves as the producer. And if you quote Suno with some of these producer tags, Suno is actually reproducing those Suno tags, and that is actually interesting and problematic, and we will see in a second why that is. It's not necessarily why most people think it is. I actually have a different reason why I think this is problematic. So let's just listen to what they had to say about that.
So this was a Reddit post where an anonymous user shared a track he had generated with Suno's model that had a familiar sounding producer tag at the start of it. And just in case you're not familiar, a producer tag is just like a vocal trademark. It's an audio trademark that gets put into the start of a track to let the listener and the audience know which producer made the beat.
And so the interesting question here is, why does Suno actually output these producer tags? Is this something that's a glitch in the system? Is this on purpose? We will actually see in a second.
But the other piece here is whether there is direct sampling happening, right? And I think, obviously, to the point of this video is that it's really tough. I don't even know what the explanation could be, right? Is it something like, the prompts were so exact of the type of voice we want it to sound a little robotico, a little like a robot, right? We have like a radio effect on it. We want a female voice. We want it at the certain note. I don't know how specific the prompts were in order to generate this, or are we actually hearing sampling?
Well, we are not really hearing sampling in the traditional sense, but the question is, and that's actually also an interesting question, if we need to probably rethink what sampling really is, because what's happening here is that the model has learned from those samples, and then those samples are in the parameters of that model, but not in the way we are normally think of samples. So it's not that the audio is in there; it's just that under certain circumstances, the model will be able to recreate those little bits and pieces from the audio without actually having access to the actual sample. And that sounds a little counterintuitive and a little difficult to kind of wrap your head around, but that's how generative artificial intelligence works. So no, it's not sampling in the traditional sense, but yes, it is not something that should actually happen. And I'm going to talk a little bit later that this is actually one of the big issues that Suno has, because it does produce a lot of these producer tags. Even though, generative artificial intelligence sometimes does that, it should not really do that at the level that Suno does it. So while it is not possible to avoid that a generative artificial intelligence model under certain circumstances might spit out certain bits and pieces that it has learned from its training set, the fact that Suno does it at the level it does seems to indicate that what is happening here is that the model is what's called overfitted. And that essentially means that it is not really trained particularly well. Generally, you want to avoid that, right? So these generative artificial intelligence models are supposed to create something new. However, if you overtrain that, and you can do that, that's called overfitting, then under certain circumstances, the model will get worse in the sense that it will start to reproduce things that it has learned from its training set. Now, once again, this is not what is supposed to happen. It's supposed to generate something new. It only happens if the model is not really trained very well, or if the model doesn't really fit the way it is trained, if it is overfitted. So in that sense, what this tells us is really not so much that Suno has an issue in terms of violating copyright. Suno seems to have an issue with the model itself. The model is not supposed to do that. And I'm honestly not completely sure how to resolve that. There might be people out there who know that. Can you actually change the model in such a way that you can retrain it in order to make sure that that doesn't happen? But everything that I've seen so far seems to indicate that there's a technological issue within Suno, and that has to do with the way the model has been trained, because once again, the model should not reproduce these producer tags the way it does. You cannot avoid that it happens once or twice, but you should not be able to explicitly prompt it to generate the producer tag. That is actually really an issue.
How exactly is Suno's model able to pull this off? We are told by so many generative AI companies that they are not storing any data. But if that's true, then how is it that Suno's model seems to be able to generate and recreate and pull up what sounds like copyright-protected sound recordings?
So yes, it seems very counterintuitive, but that's how generative artificial intelligence works. It does not really store the data in its parameters. However, somewhere in these parameters, it is able to recreate that data. It's a little bit like, if you think about how your brain works, and if you see something and you store that visual information in your brain, it's sort of in your brain, but then again, you probably can't read it out. There's no waveform in your brain or nothing. And in exactly the same way, an artificial intelligence model, a generative artificial intelligence model, has that information in its parameter set, but it is not stored in the way we normally think of having it stored in a data set. It's not a waveform. It's you probably couldn't even read it out if you wanted to. It's just by accident sometimes happens to reproduce that because it was part of their training set. So yeah, once again, seems counterintuitive, seems a little strange, but that's how generative artificial intelligence works. It doesn't store it, but it can still reproduce it because it was part of its training set.
Did they train off of copyright-protected tracks that contained these producer tags? And is that how this model was able to source and reference those producer tags?
Now, I probably need to be very careful what I'm saying here, but in my personal opinion, the fact that Suno is able to reproduce those producer tags clearly indicates that, these producer tags have been part of its training material. Once again, whether or not this constituted copyright infringement or not, I don't know. It probably also depends on how exactly the training happened. But in my opinion, knowing what I know about artificial intelligence, this does not happen by accident. It has to be part of the training set. Otherwise, the generative artificial intelligence is not just able to by accident recreate that. That's not going to happen. It's so unlikely that once again, that you couldn't rule that out, but it's really, 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 really unlikely. So yes, in my opinion, once again, being very careful how to frame that. In my opinion, that was very, very, very likely part of its training set.
And third, should we be thinking about models like Sunos as more of a modern day sampling machine, albeit on steroids, because many times it can recreate what sounds like copyright protected music in a way that masks the original sonic quality of the artist or producer tag.
Now, this is really a super interesting point that he makes that I think is absolutely excellent, because it gets to the actual core of the problem. If we train an artificial intelligence model on music, and does this mean that the artificial intelligence is sort of like a sampling machine, kind of in the way that our brain might be considered a sampling machine, kind of in the sense that we are kind of listening to things, kind of watching things, and then kind of regurgitating the things out of our brain as sort of a very advanced sampling machine? And you could think of it that way. There's absolutely no reason why you couldn't. And this will probably kind of challenge us in reconsidering what we think about sampling. And I think one of the main purposes of this lawsuit is also to create clarity around that. Is generative artificial intelligence a way of sampling? There is a good argument to be made that it is. But there's also an argument to be made that it isn't. And my feeling is that probably needs to be sorted out in a way that is legally kind of consistent and that makes sure that everybody works under the same rules. So yes, this is a super interesting kind of question. And, honestly, I haven't thought about that before I watched that video, but that really nails it. I think that is an outstanding point.
If it turns out that these platforms have done all the things that are being alleged against them, that they downloaded copies of the music, they had the AI trained from it, and then maybe there's just a little glitch happening, right? So the little glitch in that the platforms just haven't been refined just yet, and so they're spitting out things that they learned or remembered, but they weren't supposed to, right? This was a mistake. I don't know if that's going to be the explanation. And this is going to get beat up quite a bit in the federal courts over copyright infringement. But the point just being of what's your feeling on it, right? So should the labels get paid? They own the music. And if you're going to go and train your AI off of copyrighted content, you need to pay.
Now, this is also a really excellent point. I just wanted to kind of add to that this is not a glitch. This is how generative artificial intelligence works. Now, once again, you would normally try to avoid that it regurgitates things out of its training set, because if it does that, that means that the model is not of the quality you want it to be. A really, really good generative artificial intelligence model does not really copy things. It's not supposed to. But you cannot, and that's an important thing to say, you cannot make sure that it doesn't. In certain situations, it might. Do we have control over that? Not really, because we don't really know where the data is stored in the model itself, because it is not stored in the way we normally store audio data. It's not a waveform, once again. It's just in the parameter set, and we don't really know exactly how the model is incorporated in the parameter set. So it's not really a glitch, it's a feature. And because it is a feature of generative artificial intelligence, there need to be rules around that. And once again, we're coming back to the same kind of argument that I'm making constantly. And that is, the lawsuit is supposed to set precedent on how to deal with that. How to deal with the fact that we cannot make sure that these models recreate certain things that they have seen in the training set. And how do we handle that? Does it mean that there's copyright infringement? Who infringes on the copyright? Is it the company or the user who kind of uses that? Those are all really, really important questions that we quite frankly have no answers for. And my feeling is that this lawsuit is primarily meant to sort that out. But this brings me to my conclusion. So let's summarize my main points that I wanted to point out in this video. So first of all, no, this is not the beginning of the end of AI music. Rather, it is the beginning of the beginning. The main purpose of this lawsuit is to establish precedent on how to deal with copyright issues in a world of AI-generated music. 2, I'm nearly 100% certain that both Suno as well as Udio expected this lawsuit from the very beginning, and they have financially planned for it. They need clarification about these copyright issues as much as the recording industry needs it, but they obviously couldn't be the one to sue themselves, so they needed the recording industry to do that. But I think this was planned from the very beginning. 3, I would be very careful about being too optimistic about what this means for artists. The music production world will be disrupted by AI no matter what. In my opinion, the recording industry's main intention is really to make sure that they are not left out of this development. Some artists will benefit from this, others might not. 4, one of the key questions that needs to be answered is how copyright is handled for AI-generated music. At the moment, AI-generated music is generally not copyrightable because copyright requires human creation. To me, that seems to be an issue since it indicates that there is no commercial interest in AI-generated music, and companies such as Suno and Udio will therefore always be able to make the fair use argument, and that means that artists as well as record labels need to make sure that there is some sort of copyright attached to AI-generated music in order to enforce that. If you don't have a copyright that you can't enforce, you can't enforce it. 5, the fact that Suno regurgitates producer tags is not a glitch. It is an indication that the model that Suno uses is overfitted. And this points to a much deeper technological issue in Suno's technology. A proper AI is not supposed to do that, at least not at the level that Suno does it. And that means that there's actually a bigger issue here, a bigger technological issue for Suno. It's doing things that's not supposed to be done by a good model. It's not a good model, apparently, and they need to think very carefully on how to kind of correct that. 6, however, it is really important to point out that these models will always have the risk of regurgitating bits and pieces of their training set. This does not mean that the system has that copyrighted data stored anywhere, though. It most likely doesn't even know that it regurgitated something from its training set. It simply doesn't know that. It will be very interesting to see how this problem will be resolved. Personally, I would expect to see the emergence of some sort of content ID system on top of these music generation models. A content ID system that makes sure that whenever the model creates something, it is tested against the music database in order to make sure that nothing that the model created is violating any copyright laws, because once again, the model doesn't know if it did that, and the user probably doesn't know either. So there probably needs to be some sort of system on top of that that just makes sure that no copyright is violated. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments. And with that being said, see you all in the next video.